Well, President Xi walked away from his meeting with President Biden on Wednesday, seemingly optimistic, saying it is not an option for the two countries to turn their backs on each other. He added, quote, planet Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed. President Biden called the discussions some of the most productive he's had with Xi. So will these efforts last? Joining us now is Ambassador Kurt Tong, the Asia Group Managing Partner Executive Committee member. Kurt, it's always good to talk to you. You know, despite some of those optimistic declarations that were made publicly, in the press conference post-meeting, President Biden said he didn't necessarily change his characterization of Xi as a dictator. I mean, how would you characterize a 4-hour meeting between these two leaders, given how low the expectations were going in?
So I think you've accurately reported it that the expectations were met. The objective of both sides was to establish a more stable conversation and put a floor under what at times over the past few years has seemed like a rapidly deteriorating relationship. And so they've been successful in reestablishing channels of communications, reaching some modest forward progress on some issues of concern to the United States. And I think looking forward, the goal is to have a relationship which is framed the way the United States wants it framed, which is primarily competitive, but not framed in such a way that it leads to a lot of downside risk. So managed competition is what both sides are seeking at this point, which is a very different state of affairs from some years ago, where the effort was to actually improve the relationship. Now I think it's just to stabilize it.
And to that point, Kurt, we looked at the Asia pivot when we had former President Obama. Then it was America first, trade wars, tariffs as well, and as a phase one trade deal that had a lot of promises, but not a lot of results. What do you think is going to be the defining narrative for the Biden administration and China? Especially, you have two countries focused on high tech as being the next leg of growth for both of their economies.
Right. So I think the punchline for the Biden administration, and this is one that Secretary Raimondo used again last night, is that the U.S. and China will compete where they must, and the U.S. will defend its interests where it must, but seek to work together and have an active economic relationship in any way that they can to the benefit of both nations. So it's very much a balance point, trying to strike, have a primarily competitive relationship with one of the most important trade and investment partners for the United States simultaneously. Frankly, I think this was a very important meeting in setting that direction and maintaining that direction, at least for perhaps the next half year or so.
This was clearly a very choreographed meeting, and this wasn't just about playing to the U.S. audience as well as those executives that had been in attendance of the APEC CEO summit. It was also about playing to a domestic audience for Xi Jinping at a time when the slowdown has happened, right? There's still growth happening in China. It's not at sort of the 8% level that we saw previously. How would you assess where the economy is right now? I mean, how jittery is the footing for China? And ultimately, what does that mean for Xi Jinping in managing the country?
Absolutely. I think there's deep concern in Beijing about the state of the macroeconomy, a reassessment of its strengths and weaknesses, and a real sense that for China to continue to grow at a reasonable level to meet its development goals, it's going to need to accommodate foreign interests to a greater extent than its political system would naturally do. Political system is geared to be exclusionary, top-down, control-based, and highly politicized. That none of those are good features for an open and successful market economy. So we are feeling that there's a sense that there's a re-injection of this sense within China that the market needs to be treated with respect. Now, that's going to be the devil's in the details, and it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for foreign firms as well as Chinese firms to navigate through a complex environment. But there is a renewed sense just in the last few months that China needs to recalculate the degree to which it was prioritizing security over economics.
And Kurt, I have to ask you, because we've seen a lot of reshaping alliances, whether it was over how China's perceived interactions with Russia over its invasion in Ukraine, a lot of advanced technological pressures as well, especially we're seeing the US getting Australia, getting the EU on board as well. How does the reshaping of alliances affect what we see with multinational companies who are still interested in China, but this is a very different Chinese economy?
So businesses want to be left out of the conversation about issues like what to do about the Israel situation, about Ukraine, but they do get caught up in it when sanctions come into play, and when there are specific political actions that affect markets. In the U.S.-China relationship, the government sense, I think there was an important conversation yesterday of trying to find points on which the U.S. and China agree. For example, I think it's in the interest of both the U.S. and China that the situation in the Middle East not expand to become a broader conflagration that would limit energy exports and create real instability in the global economy. That's an interest for China. It's an interest for the United States. And so perhaps through communication, we can encourage China to play a somewhat more constructive role in that region.
Ambassador Kurt Tong, the Asia Group Managing Partner and Executive Committee member. Always good to get your perspective. Appreciate the time today.
Great to see you. Thank you.